Welcome to Whatsoever and More or Less. My name is Jason, and today I've got a thought for you on Article 1, Section 8, which I've taken my time creating the slideshow. I was kicking around the idea of doing Section 8, 9, and 10, while also simultaneously covering the 10th Amendment. I've got a bottle baby who's hearing my voice and she wants another bottle. You already got your bottle. Anyhow, so here's the big deal, is that she's not convinced. You're already eating hay too. Here's the point, you guys. Article 1, Section 8. What's the big deal? It's preceded by Article 1, Section 7. Article 1, Section 7 tells us how laws are passed, what the thresholds are, which branches have to check. In this case, you'll notice with all powers exercised in the Constitution that there's always a check. If it's part of what's Article 6, Clause 2, there's always a check on exercising that power. So in other words, the check on exercising legislation is the president's veto power, right? The check on treaty power is the Senate's confirmation. The check on the amendments is the 3/4 of state legislatures. That's a massive threshold, by the way. So Article 1, Section 7 tells us how the bills are made. Article 1, Section 8 tells us the main, continuous, ongoing, regular powers that can be exercised. And then Article 1, Section 9 does immediately open with the power regarding immigration and importation of persons, which wasn't allowed to be exercised until after 1808, right? And then Clause 2 of Section 9 deals with habeas corpus, which is a limited power only for special occasions where Congress may go ahead and limit habeas corpus. There's also powers granted earlier in regarding the times, manners, and places of elections of the senators and everything like that. That's covered earlier in Article 1, I believe Section 4. And that's mostly a power that's in the hands of the state government. It's not a main power of the federal government. It's not an ongoing, continuous power of the federal government, but it's a check they have just in case the state governments get out of control in the way they're handling this or that. I think it's only allowed to affect the times and manners, if I'm not mistaken. Then you've got Article 4, Section 3, Clause 2. In Article 4, Section 3, Clause 2 is an implied power that's temporary power. It deals with admitting states to the Union. When states are admitted to the Union, the federal government may, as was standard for treaties back in those days, treaties were understood to be a very limited thing, but one thing they could do is purchase land. That the federal government may be admitting a new state to the Union that it contains land that the federal government purchased by way of treaty. Now, that's a power that's a temporary power. That's why it says dispose of. Dispose of means that it's not permanent, and that instead they've temporarily hold the land and they can decide how to sell it, to who to sell it. But it's not part of that permanent set of powers that the federal government has for land ownership that's in Article 1, Section 8, Clause 17. Sorry, I keep having to adjust my phone. I don't know why this setup is so bad this morning. But anyhow, Clause 17 in Article 1, Section 8 tells us the permanent purposes for which federal government can own the lands. But Article 4, Section 3, Clause 2 references the concept that, say, for example, you have the Louisiana Purchase, which is a valid exercise of the treaty power, especially when you're considering they were trying to get these ports, which fulfilled Article 1, Section 17. They weren't trying to get the Louisiana Purchase for permanent ownership of the federal government. Most of what was purchased by the Louisiana Purchase ultimately got sold out to homesteads and other purposes, except for the ports, the forts, the arsenals, the magazines, whatever they're called, all that stuff that's listed in Article 1, Section 8, Clause 17. So, and then you have Article 3, Section 2, Clause 2 has the exceptions clause. That is not a regular power of the federal Congress. But if, for example, they say, wait a second, the Supreme Court is getting out of hand, they're exercising too much power over these types of cases or those types of cases, then the Supreme Court or the federal Congress may suddenly issue an exception. Now, there's already a limited list, by the way, for anybody that misunderstands. Article 1, Section 8, Madison made it quite clear in one of the Federalist Papers, like 51 or 52, where he said that Article 1, Section 8, Clause 1 is not an all-encompassing general welfare and common defense type of power. As a matter of fact, if you look prior to general welfare and common defense, it says to pay debts. And then if you look at the order of the powers laid out in Article 1, Section 8, it's first off, it's one big complete sentence spread out across 18 clauses divided by semicolons. And the first clause 2 deals with then the ability of the federal government to take debts. So then clauses 2 through 9 deal with the 3 through 9 deal with general welfare type concepts such as post roads, weights and measures, uniform rules of bankruptcy and naturalization. Sorry, I know them all. I could say them pretty well, but not off the top of my head super fast. So anyhow, those are what we'd call general welfare powers, right? And then clauses 10 through 17 really deal with common defense. So the main purpose for which the federal government was ever authorized in the first place to own land was for purposes that dealt with common defense, honestly, except for the capital. The capital was allowed to have 10 square miles, right? Where else do we have implied powers? Article 5, the implied powers. That's a time-to-time power. It's not a permanent ongoing power, but Congress may propose amendments to the Constitution, right? So that's another power that Congress has. It's just not an ongoing power. They've got the power of impeachment, right? That specifically the House of Representatives does the impeaching, the Senate does the convicting. All those types of powers that aren't in Article 1, Section 8, they're not meant to be permanent, ongoing powers that are happening on a regular basis. And why do I bring this up? I just listened to somebody whining about our federal lands. Dude, stop calling them our federal lands. Hardly anybody uses those lands, first off. Federal lands, where it's never meant to be a thing. As a matter of fact, it's a violation of the grievances laid out in the Declaration of Independence, which was one of the ones they weren't allowing people to settle the lands, right? We're doing it all over again. Hey, that's fantastic. Look, man, the people who are running these federal lands, they get to run those lands whether they do a good job or not, and they get paid by force, right? Because government is force, and government can take those tax dollars and pay those people whether they're doing a good job running it or not. There's no accountability. It's just not a power ever granted. It was not the way they understood the Constitution, right? The tradition of the founders is cautious textualism, right? In other words, George Washington could have run for a third term, but he didn't want to, right? He thought that might be pushing it too far, plus I think he was ready for retirement. Madison could have vetoed the Sedition Act, but he thought maybe that's a little bit too much disrespect for Congress. It took a while for them to kind of settle into these ideas. And Jefferson was nervous about the Louisiana Purchase. My goats sometimes try to make a dash. I'm working on creating a separate feeding section for my guard dogs that are getting trained right now. But sometimes the goats think that they're just allowed to go for it. So anyhow, that would be terrible for them. Dog food is so bad for goats, but they like the sweetness of it. So calm down, Sunday. I'm almost done, buddy. They're coming to me for attention now. So stay still, buddy. You're a good dog. That's right. Anyhow, you guys, Article 1, Section 8 is where the regular ongoing powers of Congress are. Everything else, there are all sorts of other powers in the Constitution in at least 4 or 5 different places that Congress has, but they're not supposed to be part of the daily operations of the federal government. That's the big deal. We will get into breaking it down a little bit more with a slideshow soon here, but I just wanted to cover that real quick. Article 1, Section 8, that's the real powers that were meant to be the regular duties of Congress And that's it. And those powers, when exercised, they have a check on them. Let's cover this again. There is no check on the Supreme Court. None. Okay, and it's not written in. When the Supreme Court makes a ruling, who gets to veto their rulings? Which branch gets to give 2/3 approval to the ruling of the Supreme Court? Or, does the states get to issue then a 3/4 legislature approval of what the Supreme Court just did? No. It's not part of the Constitution. Let's not be fooled by that. There's literally no check on it, and there's no check on it because it wasn't even a thing back then. It never made it into state constitutions. It wasn't part of normal understanding what judicial powers were back then. It developed in the third administration, you could say, or basically the fourth term of presidency, Marshall. And even then, he didn't assert, I should say, what the Supreme Court has been asserting in this recent generation. They've taken it even further than he took it. So, anyhow, that's what I've got. Article 1, Section 8. It's the permanent powers. All other powers, Article 4, Section 3, Clause 2. That's not a permanent power, guys. Let's not misunderstand that. That's part of, say, for example, the admitting of states to the Union. Once they're admitted, you don't hold on to that land forever. I don't care if a state constitution says we're giving this land to the federal government. It's besides the point. The federal government does not have that power. They just don't. So for them to continue to run it, even if the state says go ahead and keep running it, it doesn't matter. The state cannot grant the powers of the federal government a power it doesn't have. Okay, the only way for the federal government to get new powers is through Article 5. That's it. All right, thanks for listening, guys.